You're standing in front of a five-story apartment block in Leningrad in February of 1962. It's -22 outside, snow on the railings, steam rising from a manhole cover at the curb. There is no furnace in the basement of this building, no boiler, no fuel tank. Not a single resident pays a heating bill. And inside every apartment in that block, the radiators are too hot to touch. Warm enough that families walk around in shirt sleeves while a Soviet winter tries to kill anyone who stays outside for more than 10 minutes. This is the system that heated entire Soviet cities for free, not subsidized, free. The pipes coming into that building carry heat the power plant down the road was throwing away anyway. The Soviets built it at industrial scale starting in the 1930s. American engineers studied the technical literature for 40 years. And the documents that explained how it actually worked sat translated and shelved inside U.S. government archives until 1991, when nobody needed to hide them anymore. After the last video on Amish cooling, hundreds of you wrote the same question in the comments. What about winter? What about heating a home when it's 20 below outside? So I pulled every Soviet engineering document I could find that's been translated into English in the last 30 years. And what's inside them is the same physics the Romans used to heat their bathhouses, scaled up to the size of a country. Here's the number that changes everything. A coal-fired power plant converts roughly 1/3 of its fuel into electricity. The other 2/3, call it 60 to 65%, leaves the plant as heat. In the United States, that heat goes up cooling towers as steam, or into rivers as warm water, or straight into the sky. It is the single largest unused energy source in the country. The Soviets looked at the same equation in the 1920s and made a different decision. They piped the waste heat into the cities. They called the system teplofikatsiya, roughly translated heatification. The concept itself is old. Thomas Edison's first power station on Pearl Street in Manhattan in 1882 sold both electricity and steam heat to neighboring buildings. Combined heat and power, what engineers today call cogeneration, was the original design. But in the United States, the electric utilities and the gas utilities split into separate industries with separate customers and separate billing departments, and the idea of giving heat away as a byproduct died inside that corporate structure. In the Soviet Union, there were no competing utilities. There was one ministry, and the ministry did the math. The math was brutal. A standalone power plant burns fuel at around 35% efficiency. A standalone home boiler burns fuel at around 80% efficiency. But a properly engineered combined heat and power plant captures both the electricity and the heat at the same time and runs at an overall efficiency above 85%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is roughly half the fuel for the same output. The Krzyzhanovsky Power Engineering Institute in Moscow, founded in 1930, became one of the world's first dedicated research centers for this kind of engineering. By the late 1980s, Soviet district heating networks served, according to International Energy Agency figures published after the archives opened, the majority of urban residential buildings across the country. And here's where the scale becomes hard to believe. The Moscow heat network alone, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, ran a buried system of insulated pipe that stretched for thousands of kilometers under the streets. Hot water at temperatures around 130 degrees Celsius left the power plant, traveled through buried mains, branched into neighborhood substations, and arrived at radiators inside apartments that no resident had to maintain, fuel, or even understand. The thermostat in a Soviet apartment was usually a window. If it got too warm, you opened it. The heat itself cost the resident nothing because the fuel had already been burned to make electricity for the same city. Now ask why this never crossed the Atlantic. In 1978, the United States passed the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, which on paper opened the door to cogeneration. In practice, the existing utility structure had already spent 50 years building infrastructure that assumed waste heat would be wasted. Coal plants were sited far from cities, near rivers and rail lines, where the heat could not be recovered economically. Gas distribution companies sold furnaces. Electric companies sold electric heat. Every American home became a customer of two separate energy industries that both had a financial interest in selling more, not in delivering the same comfort with less fuel. The Soviet model required cooperation between sectors that, in America, did not exist. The technical documentation was never secret in any classical sense. It was published in Russian, in Soviet engineering journals, throughout the 1950s and 60s. But translation was slow, expensive, and politically uncomfortable. American engineering schools during the Cold War were not in the habit of teaching their students that the Soviets had solved a major energy problem more elegantly than the United States had. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, the documents became widely available almost overnight. Western researchers, particularly in Denmark, Germany, and Finland, studied them carefully. Those countries then built their own district heating networks. Denmark today heats well over half of its homes this way. The United States heats less than 1%. But district heating requires a city. It requires pipes under streets and a power plant nearby. If you live in a Soviet-style apartment block, the system is built for you. If you live in a single-family home in rural Ohio, the city is not coming to lay pipe under your driveway. So the question becomes this: is there a piece of the same physics, the same idea of capturing heat that already exists and moving it where you actually need it, that fits a single house? And the answer, buried in the same Soviet engineering literature, is yes. The Soviets invested heavily in what English-language engineers eventually called the heat pipe. The principle was first described in a U.S. patent by Richard Gaugler in 1944, then developed seriously at Los Alamos by George Grover in the early 1960s. Soviet research institutes, particularly in Kiev and Minsk, pushed the same physics forward in parallel during the same decade. A heat pipe is a sealed tube containing a small amount of fluid. Heat at one end evaporates the fluid. The vapor travels to the cold end and condenses, releasing the heat there. Then gravity pulls the liquid back. There is no pump. There is no electricity. There is no moving part of any kind. It is the closest thing engineering has produced to free heat transport. A homeowner version of this exists today, and it looks like almost nothing. A dark metal panel on a south-facing wall. Inside the panel, a sealed copper coil. The sun heats the fluid. The fluid rises by thermosiphon, convection only, no pump, through a pipe that enters the house. Inside the house, the fluid passes through a heat exchanger and dumps its heat into the air or into a water tank, then falls back to the panel by gravity to be heated again the next time the sun touches it. The materials cost between $300 and $600, depending on the size of the panel. The closer parallel to the Soviet free heat principle, though, is not the sun. It is whatever heat source already exists on your property that you are paying to throw away. A wood stove vents most of its heat up the chimney. A clothes dryer pushes warm air outside through a vent in the wall. A refrigerator dumps the heat from its coils into your kitchen in summer when you do not want it. Every one of these is, in miniature, the same equation the Soviets solved at city scale. The heat has already been generated. The fuel has already been burned. Capturing it and routing it costs almost nothing compared to generating new heat from scratch. A man I spoke with in eastern Kentucky built a version of this in the corner of his basement. He runs a small wood stove for heat in the winter. The flue used to send most of the stove's heat straight up through the roof and into the sky. 3 winters ago, he wrapped a length of copper pipe around the flue inside a metal jacket, ran the pipe to a small insulated water tank in his utility room, and let thermosiphon do the rest. The pipe captures heat that was leaving the building anyway and transfers it to the water tank, which now supplies his hot water through the entire heating season. His electric water heater has not been switched on since November of that year. He spent under $200 on copper, fittings, and insulation. No permit was required because he never touched the chimney structure itself or the plumbing inside the house. The loop sits alongside both, intercepting heat that no inspector ever counted in the first place. The principle is identical to what a Soviet engineer in 1962 would have recognized immediately. Heat that is already being produced costs nothing extra to redirect. The expensive part of any heating system is making heat. Moving heat that already exists is, in energy terms, almost free. That idea is older than the Soviet Union by several thousand years. Roman hypocausts ran the hot exhaust from a single basement fire under the floors of entire bathhouses, heating rooms hundreds of feet from the fire itself. Korean ondol floors did the same thing for nearly 3,000 years, channeling smoke from the cooking hearth through stone passages beneath sleeping rooms. The Chinese Kong, the Iranian Korsi, the Turkish Tandir, every civilization that survived a serious winter arrived independently at the same conclusion. You do not heat a building by burning more fuel. You heat it by being honest about how much heat you are already producing and refusing to let it escape. The Soviets industrialized that idea. Then the United States ignored it for 2 generations because the structure of its energy market had no place for an answer that made fuel companies sell less fuel. The technical literature was never truly classified in the formal sense. It was something more effective than that. It was inconvenient. And in an industry where the average American household now spends, according to Department of Energy figures, well over $1,000 a year on heating alone, inconvenient knowledge is the most reliably suppressed kind. The Soviets are gone. The archives are open. The physics never depended on either of them. If you live in a city with an old power plant nearby, look up whether your municipality has ever studied district heating. Many have, and the studies usually sit unread on a planning department shelf. If you live in a single house, look at every source of heat already inside it and ask where that heat is going. Drop your state in the comments and tell me what you pay to heat your home through the winter. Tell me if your grandparents had a coal stove with a water jacket on the back, because that is the same physics with a different name. Next week, I am going to show you the Soviet apartment ventilation system that recovers 90% of the heat from outgoing air using nothing but 2 sheets of metal and a fan smaller than a soup can. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it. The Soviets did not lose this knowledge. You were just never given it. Now you have it.